For 26 years, Congressman Ron Paul has been vocal about abolishing the U.S. Federal Reserve. He's written a new book called End the Fed, in which he explains why inflating the American currency will have tragic financial consequences. Well, RT's Marina Portnaya sat down with him in New York to discover why he blames the Fed for, quote, almost everything.
U.S. Congressman Ron Paul has been leading a fight against the Federal Reserve for decades, and recently his actions have hit a breakthrough. Joining me now here in New York City is the Congressman himself, Ron Paul. Thanks for sitting down with us during your brief visit here.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you about a piece of legislation you've introduced into the House of Representatives. It would require broad congressional auditing of how the Federal Reserve conducts its monetary policy. 2/3 of the House is co-sponsoring this piece of legislation. Obviously a big breakthrough for you. Let's talk about what exactly it means for Americans.
The bill technically removes all the prohibitions to the Congress for not looking into the Federal Reserve. They're allowed to audit the Federal Reserve except for the important things that they don't want to be audited for. And this removes those prohibitions. And they more or less have tried, people have talked about doing this ever since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, but it's never gotten very far. But like you say, we have more than 2/3. 2/3 is 280, and we have 295. And I believe that's a reflection of the seriousness of our economic crisis and the lack of oversight that the Congress has done, you know, either for the TARP funds or now for what the Federal Reserve does. A lot of people just didn't pay attention to the Federal Reserve because as long as things were rocking along rather well, nobody worried too much. But now that we're in a serious crisis, they are looking to try to understand the monetary system and the financial system, and they're looking in the right place, and that is the Federal Reserve.
But the reality is you introduced this bill more than a quarter of a century ago, in 1983. What has taken so long for your colleagues to get on board and actually move forward?
Because people weren't worried enough. And back then I was worried. I got concerned out of the 70s and, you know, with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods, and that's why I actually ran for Congress to talk about the financial situation and that it would get out of hand. It would cause too much debt and too much growth of government. It would encourage our building of our empire. And yet people never felt panicked enough. Today, they have felt very concerned about what's happening, and that's why we've gotten the support. I wasn't able to convince my colleagues of it as much as the people in this country heard about it, and they lobbied their own congressmen, and that's how we got so many co-signers on the bill.
As it turns out, the Obama administration is actually pushing to give the Federal Reserve more powers and more authority to supervise, possibly in secrecy. I can imagine you find this very disconcerting.
The fact that they want to give them even more power, yeah, it's rather ironic. I blame the Fed for almost everything, at least the basic flaw of the inflationary bubbles that we have. And here, the people who misunderstand it all said, well, we didn't have enough regulations. The Federal Reserve didn't have enough power. Let's give them more power. It makes no sense whatsoever, because I believe in a free market, and there are different ways you regulate in a free market. You allow companies to go bankrupt, and you don't tax the successful people. So we have done exactly the opposite. This whole idea that we would give the Federal Reserve more power, it doesn't make any sense at all.
It may come as no surprise that the Federal Reserve is opposed to your piece of legislation, arguing that it would weaken the bank's independence and hamper central banks' ability to protect financial systems. Are you surprised by their comment?
Not really. From their viewpoint, that may be the case. If we find out what they're doing, it's going to hinder them in taking care of their friends, not in taking care of the American people. They say they need independence and secrecy to protect the public interest. But how could a secret bank of 7 people doing monetary policy, inflating the currency and fixing interest rate and bailing out their friends be in the public's interest? So no, to protect their system, they want total secrecy. They call it independence, but what they're really talking about is secrecy. And of course, what I'm talking about is openness and oversight and trying to get to the bottom of the financial bubbles and the business cycle that we have. And we're in the midst of one serious downturn, which I think is going to continue because we continue to do all the wrong things.
We've actually seen the frustration building up in this country, for example, with the tea parties that have been taking place all year long. Some critics say that some demonstrators taking part in these events are actually racist and inciting hate against President Obama. Are any actions that are taking part in these events concerning to you? Well,
I'm concerned about why the people are so upset. I'm not concerned that the people are upset. They're upset, they're angry, they're confused, and they're directing their attention in the right place, like the Federal Reserve and to Washington and spending and debts and the takeover of health care. And I think that's very, very healthy. I'm concerned because Washington doesn't respond to them. But because of this climactic end to a system of government that has been going on for 30 or 40 years of spending and borrowing and inflating, that's coming to an end. And people are scared to death because they're not only are the people who have to pay the bill scared that they're going to go broke because we tax the banks that didn't get into trouble to bail out the banks that did get into trouble. But the people who receive free services from the government, which means they took it from somebody else, the people who pay, they're scared to death because they know their standard of living is going down. Good people lose their jobs. And at the same time, the people on the receiving end, they realize that the government doesn't have much anymore. The credibility is gone. So this is a climactic event that's happening, and we won't be forced to go along with the status quo. It can't happen. We have to decide in this country one way or the other. We either have to decide that freedom works, the market works, sound money works, our Constitution is worthwhile, or we march on to some socialistic, dictatorial, authoritarian government. And right now, everything in Washington is moving in that direction.
Let's switch gears for a sec and discuss foreign policy, specifically concerning Iran. You've said that the recent actions taken by the international community against Iran is warmongering, and this revolves around the secret nuclear plant that was recently discovered. How so?
I don't like what's going on because I don't think it's in our interest. It's not in America's interest to go and antagonize and try to stir up trouble. Yes, it's a serious matter what's happening in Iran, but we don't have any right to spend tens of millions of dollars in a program with our CIA to have an overthrow of their government. And we're still involved. We've been involved in messing around with that government since 1953, and it's not in our interest. And we have such a mess over there now. We're still deeply involved in Iraq. You know, we're replacing a couple of troops with a whole lot of contractors. We're deeply bogged down in Afghanistan every day. That deteriorates. We're constantly bombing Pakistan. And here now we're stirring up trouble. If we put on stronger sanctions against the Iranians, that is an act of war. If somebody came and put sanctions on us and prevented our imports, we would consider that an act of war. So what benefit will it be to us? We're already bankrupt, and it's not going to make us safer. To me, that just stirs up more hatred toward us. Every time, every time somebody gets killed over there, whether we do it directly or indirectly, and we say, "Oh, they're the Taliban, they're the radicals, and they're the ones who cause trouble." They don't know that. I mean, they're people who are, in the 1980s, they were our friends. And we were allies with them and trying to keep the Soviets out of there. But every time somebody's killed over there and we get blamed, that's just more hatred directed toward us. It drives us further into bankruptcy. So the end of our empire must come for moral reasons, for constitutional reasons, but mostly economic reasons. It will come, and that contributes to this anger and frustration that so many people feel in this country. The majority of the American people don't even support putting more troops in Afghanistan. Of course, my position is much different. It's not that I don't want more troops in Afghanistan. I want them all to come home. And that, to me, is what would be in the best interest of the United States.
So if you feel that this new second nuclear plant is not such a risk to the international community, why do you think Russia has taken the actions it's taken and aligned itself a little bit more with the U.S. and Europe in terms of the way to approach Iran?
Well, I think there's been some diplomatic things going on because the anti-ballistic missile plans of Eastern Europe were removed, and they're probably playing a little cat and mouse. I think this whole thing is going to benefit China the most because China has all our dollars, or a lot of our dollars. They're going to be more motivated to spend dollars, and they will go and they will buy their influence in a legitimate capitalistic sense. They're going to invest dollars in Iran and influence Iran and maybe buy their oil. Maybe they'll help them on, there'll be a stronger motivation to get more refineries so they don't have to worry about imported gasoline. So I think this gives a tremendous boost to China and hurts us tremendously. But I just don't think Russia's heart's in it. I don't think Russia is necessarily going to. They're more likely to be aligned with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the group of countries that have gotten together to counterbalance our influence in that region.
Well, we've seen President Obama step out on the international stage addressing the General Assembly at the United Nations. You have to acknowledge that he does have a much different tone from his predecessor, from the Bush administration. It seemed as though he was reaching his hand out to the international community and willing to work with everyone who respects international law. Were you happy with his performance?
I know. I think the tone is better, but I don't think it's been followed up with action. If it would be, we wouldn't be begging and pleading to get more troops over there and threatening Iran. I mean, in one hand, it's diplomacy. At the other hand, is a big stick. I don't think policies have changed. I think the tone has changed, and that is good. But sometimes when the tone changes, it disarms the people. So the anti-war people in this country then let their guard down and say, Obama is great. He's talking. He talks more softly, and this is very good. So we don't want to criticize him at this time. At the same time, we move closer to a much greater conflict in the region. That's what I worry about.
Let's talk about why you actually are here in New York City. Your book has become so popular, your book End the Fed, that it's still a widespread bestseller, and you're here for a book signing, conducting interviews all day long. Are you surprised that this movement that you inspired so many years back is still gaining so much momentum?
I don't think it's as much about me, except I'm delivering a message that they've been waiting for, to bring a lot of people together who have been frustrated about politics, sick of Republicans and Democrats, and all of a sudden hearing the message that they have believed in, believing in the rule of law, the Constitution, personal liberty, economic prosperity coming from the market rather than from government. And now there's been a lot of people I have found that have thought about and studied the Federal Reserve. It's excited young people in colleges that are inheriting a bad situation. So I think it's all come together, and if they still want to hear this message, I'm willing to deliver it.